Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, a CISO's perspective on presenting OT risk to the board, sponsored by CyberX. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Ilan Abadi, CISO, Tava Pharmaceutical Industries Limited, and Daniel Shagru, Senior Director of Industrial Cybersecurity at CyberX. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Dan.
Thank you very much, Carol, and welcome listeners around the world. And thank you for logging on and joining Ilan and me today. I'm very happy to have Ilan on the webinar today. Ilan Abadi is the Vice President and CISO at Teva Pharmaceutical Industries Incorporated, which is a $19 billion multinational pharmaceutical company. He has 19 years of experience in security at global firms where his responsibilities included management of cyber incident response in heavily regulated OT industries. And his previous positions include being the CISO for the National Israeli Police and the CISO for a leading satellite broadcast firm. Welcome, Ilan, to the webinar.
Thank you very much, Dan. Welcome you also, and all, of course.
Thank you. So let's jump right in. We are going to cover today why present to the board of directors, what to present to the board, including establishing the scope of risk, tying risk to business value, introducing a framework for thinking about cybersecurity, enlisting board support, establishing metrics, and then finally some tips and tricks on how to present to the board. I want to jump in with the why with a proverb from one of my favorite management consultants, which is Peter Drucker, who used to say that he used to quote a Danish proverb that said essentially, never go to the prince until he asks for you twice. So basically, if you can do your job without asking for support from management or the prince, just go ahead and do it. Having said that, there are several advantages to having an opportunity to go before the board. And so there are reasons why you might even want to ask to see the prince, in other words. And those are, you can get visibility for your own efforts. You can probably most importantly get budget, but budget isn't always the limiting factor in security. Sometimes it's getting time from coworkers or from other departments and getting cooperation from those departments. So those are three reasons why you might actually want to go to the prince or the board. But then the other reason is you present to the board because the board wants you to. Especially in recent years with more and more media attention to attacks and vulnerabilities, the board is likely going to ask you to present, whether you want to or not. And in fact, Gartner said in 2018 that by 2020, which is just next year, 100% of large enterprises will be asked to report to their board of directors on cybersecurity and technology risk, at least annually, which is up from 40% now. And actually, I wanted to ask Ilan to chime in and just get his experience at Teva over the years. How often does the board ask you to speak, and has that shifted over the years?
Thank you, Dan, for the questions. So I first want to say that I like the prince, the twice that you need to ask you, but I think when the board is asking you to come, it's like it's an offer that you cannot refuse, like you have in the Godfather. You cannot refuse that. You need only once they're going to ask you to come.
Fair enough. Yes.
So I think it's about how many times. I think most of the time it's one in a quarter. And sometimes there is a very tight scheduling for the board, so it can be 3 times. And sometimes, some year, there is sometimes 5th and 6th times, because there is some big event, cyber event is happening, like WannaCry or NotPetya, and this is put all the member of the board on anxiety, kind of an anxiety. And then they ask you to come and to see if there is any, what they exposed to the risk, of the organization, of the business, and how we're dealing with that, and if we are on control with that. So it can come from 3 times in a year and 5, 6 times. And I think that if there is a big event that impact the business, you probably will go to the board, not in a nice way, but it's between 3, 6, 7 times sometimes in a year, depend about the year. Done.
That makes sense. Yeah. So sometimes you're reporting proactively on metrics that you've set up. Other times you're going to react to news, if I understand you correctly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Has there been an evolution in terms of to whom you are reporting? Like sometimes you report to the board itself, and does the board also have committees set up?
So it's independent how the company is considering the cyber risk. If the cyber risk is one of the risks that managed by the board or by the risk office, so you probably will need to go to the audit committee board for that, and they are managing the risk of the company that you're working with, you're working in, and they are responsible to work with the internal audit in front of you. They are responsible for all the chart and all the reports that you have, and they are also providing to do that to the much wider board for that. So it's independent about how the company is managing. It could be the board himself. It could be the audit committee of the board.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah. So it's either reporting directly to the board in your case, or to the audit committee, which actually we're actually going to talk a little bit about, establishing frameworks and answering to regulatory bodies. So it makes sense that the audit committee would be the committee, in many corporate structures or models of governance that would have oversight over security. So I wanted to talk about, so that's sort of the why. If we get right into the how, the first step in the how is to, establish with the board the scope of risk. From the customers in general with whom I've spoken, there's a fine line between convincing the board of the risk, or talking about risk, and spreading fear, uncertainty, and doubt. But I think it can be useful to talk about why the risk is growing, or what are the drivers for the risk. And in this case, I'll often point, or customers will point out, that the rise of Bitcoin has been a big factor. So in other words, anonymous currency makes payoff in ransomware for cyber criminals easier. And we certainly saw that with WannaCry and more recently with LockerGoga. The other reason is that, or driver, is that industrialization, so cyber weapons are more widely available for purchase, so that the hackers no longer need skills, they really only need motives. They don't have to know how to code, they just need to know how to use the tools, in some cases even the services that are for hire. And then the third driver is the nationalization of threats, and that's, the difference between a group of pranksters, in their parents' basement, and, a group that is actually funded with GDP levels of budget and resources. And that makes, an attack likely like Triton to have an effect of not just monetary loss, but even potentially loss of human life. Are there other points, Ilan, that when you're establishing the scope of the risk, in other words, in the proactive meetings with the board or the audit committee, that you'll refer to or use?
So, thanks, Dan. So I can tell you that I'm going to talk about the current situation with the board. I think most of them board members fully aware for the cyber risk. They can hear the news, the media that you have every day. So they are kind of an anxiety. We need also to understand that they have kind of lack of technical. Some of them have some technical skills or knowledge for that from their previous work or job or position, but they are in a kind of anxiety. And you need to manage that. So they're shooting in the beginning all over. And then you have to make an order. What you think as CISO, you are exposed to the risk, and this is really a gentle walk when you focus on that. And you also need to understand there's very smart people in the board. You cannot just make tales and things like that. So you need to be related to the business. And as you mentioned in your slide, and we can see that you can see that in the slide. This is the 3 vectors, but some industry have other vectors. Like, for example, some groups, activist groups, that really an actor in this game. And it's independent which industry you are, which country you are working for, this company is working or recognizes. So you have other vectors, and it's very specific to each manufacturing industry. Thank you, Dan.
That makes sense. Yeah. So, I mean, one example that from recent news is, you know, if we have listeners who are in the manufacturing industry, they're probably familiar with the ransomware attack on Norsk Hydro back in March 19th of this year. And it's really it's a sobering lesson in terms of just how much damage a ransomware attack can do. So I have a quote here from the Norsk Hydro CFO. And by the way, that Norsk Hydro was really admirably transparent in discussing what happened at Norsk Hydro. And I think the industry can learn both from the facts that they shared and also how they shared it, you know, in terms of just being as transparent as they were. But it's sobering because, you know, you see that the plants were shut down worldwide. The screenshot on the right is a actual paper notice that was put on the doors of the manufacturing plants at Norsk Hydro. They couldn't use they couldn't send messages over email because the computers were down, so they actually had to put physical pieces of paper up to tell people not to connect to the network. And, you know, so if you're showing or talking to the board either reactively or proactively about this, it's a good opportunity to tie cyber risk to business value, right? If, you know, when you're talking about risk of downtime, you're essentially talking about lost revenue. When you're talking about safety incidents, you're talking about a detrimental effect on brand value. And when you're talking about environmental damage, you could be talking about regulatory fines or also brand damage. And then there's the possibility of IP theft, which can lead to loss of competitive edge. So the business values or the terms that the board is more used to thinking about and dealing with are on the right here. And, you know, you could give a real world example like this picture that was again supplied by Norsk Hydro of their plant after the attack. You can see that the screens are actually black, have gone black. And Norsk Hydro estimated themselves just 1 week after the attack, which is, it took them longer to respond, but just 1 week after the attack, they said that they had losses of $41 million US. Now, if we were to back that up and model potential losses for the board in another situation, we could, you know, as an example, take the operating revenue of the firm, and these are the actual numbers, operating revenue numbers from Norsk, which are of course publicly reported, of $18 billion, and you look at, if you know, make some assumptions, and in your, you know, with the case of a CISO, you'll have these actual figures. You won't have to assume, but you could say, okay, well, we have 260 actual working production days, which comes out to $69 million US a day. The operating capacity after the attack averaged about 88%. Obviously, that's going to vary by production line. And then, you know, the number of days at reduced capacity, in this case, just 5 days after the attack, resulted in $40 million in losses. So I want to pause there and just ask, ask for Ilan for his experience on whether or not this is the type of model you might use, and what other ways you have to communicate this type of thing to the board.
Absolutely. Everything it's about the business, how you're gonna deal with the revenue and everything. But it's not just about the revenue, Dan. It's also about safety, human safety. I don't know if the people that listening to us saw the webcam that was released by Hydro, and I think one of the first sentence was there is no personal harm or body harm that happening. So cyber attack can also make some harm to the bodies, to the employee, and this is also need to be considered. So it's about the money, you can calculate how much it's going to take. I must say that 40 million is it sounds like a big money, but it's definitely not a big money. We're absolutely aware that in the past, when I said past, it's about 12 months ago, a little bit more than that, there was like big losses, like $500 million for some company, and there was another $1.2 billion loss for a company that they claim through the insurance. So of course, it's about the money, it's about the revenue, it's about safety, or the employee safety. For that, all kind of those examples you need to bring to the board, and this is part of the scenario of the risk if something goes wrong. As I said in my last previous answer, it's also considering about what kind of business you're doing, what kind of manufacturing do you have, and what can be the outcome if it's going to be a break or explode, like heating the reactor too much, and things like that. So it's depend about industry, but definitely you can use those vectors and those calculation to represent what the impact can be. And I don't know if I can say unfortunately, but yes, I can say unfortunately, we can see a big losses to companies more than $40 million, much more than $40 million.
Yeah, noted. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you first of all for bringing up the risk to human life and safety. That's I mean, even though the board is business oriented, I mean, we can't lose sight of these things. And yeah, noted that 40 million might seem like a large number on the surface, but yeah, we've seen much larger losses taken by companies, especially in the wake of the WannaCry ransomware attacks. So moving on to, once you've established the risk, you want to establish a framework in which to think about cybersecurity. And there are analyst frameworks like those provided by companies like Gartner, and then national standards organizations like NIST that are both good models for proactive boards who want to provide structure to their OT security efforts. In some cases, proactivity is not required because legislators in the US and EU have mandated adherence to industry and governmental regulations. So, of the regulations, NIST 13 probably has the broadest impact as it applies to enterprises that provide what they call, quote, essential services, end quote, in the critical infrastructure sectors such as energy, transportation, water, health, banking, and financial, and digital infrastructures. In addition to that, enterprises in other sectors such as manufacturing and pharmaceuticals, chemicals, oil, and gas are voluntarily leveraging the NIST guidelines as a framework for improving their operational resilience. So NIST, which is European-based, and I put the emblem for them here from the European Union Agency for National Information Security. It's really the first regulation to define what they call minimum standards of due care for protecting OT networks. And that means that in the case of major safety or environmental incidences, enterprises can be held negligent and financially liable for not having taken minimum steps to prevent catastrophe, even non-EU enterprises. So US organizations as well as EU organizations are affected by NIST because they have operations in the EU. A couple of examples of frameworks that you might use, and then I'll hand over to Ilan for his experience. But one would be this, the Gartner Adaptive Security Architecture for protection from advanced attacks. So, a security system needs to be able to prevent, detect, respond, and predict. And then another would be the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So in other words, you need to identify, you need to prevent, you need to detect, respond, and then recover. So in your experience, Ilan, are frameworks helpful, or is this sort of overkill or just overhead for the conversation with the board? Or does, in your experience, do you actually use a framework when talking to the TEBA board? And you might be on mute, Ilan.
Yep, sorry for that. It was automatically. Maybe someone hacked my computer and get it to mute. So I'm sorry for that. So what I'm saying is absolutely, it's a tool that you can work with the board, and you have two approaches for that. The first approach that nobody asks you, and you need to be comply with one of these standards, if it's ISO 27001, if it's the NIST or other regulation for that. So you can put that in your slides when you're showing to the board. How you're doing it, what your score, and what is the domain, and what is more relevant to you, to your business for that. So this is a very good tool. Also, if you are not to comply or mandatory to use those kind of framework, I think from my perspective and my experience, it's very helpful. Me, myself, personally, certified for ISO 27001. Even I don't need to do that from compliance. And also we adopt the NIST for the incident response team. I think they are very good framework. You need to do some customize, some tailor-made to your organization, but there is really a structured way how you can manage enterprise organization. Without that, it will be kind of, I don't want to say chaos, but it's not going to be in order. And you definitely need an order when you're dealing with cyber threats. Dan.
I love that example. So yeah. So point taken. Even if you're not speaking to the board, it can be useful to work with a framework. So I love that you're doing that even when you're not actually having to adhere to a framework or a regulation. And then I think the other point you made that's important there is that the framework itself needs to be customized to your particular organization. So good points both. I wanted to spend a relatively quick word on cyber insurance. This is an idea that's been with us for some time. You mitigate some risks and you transfer other risks by insuring against them. And if you are going to do that, of course, the insurance policy itself needs to be highly customized to your particular organization's needs. And what we've seen amongst our customers and prospects is that typically OT-related cyber insurance will be more expensive than IT-related cyber insurance. And so, when you present to the board of directors, you should do so with a financial model that enables them to engage in an informed discussion about risk transfer. Having said that, we've seen, and Elon referred to this when we were talking about potential losses. We've seen in the last year that in some cases insurers are not paying for the losses that are associated with cyber attack. And the reasons that have been given, and this is all in the public domain, is that the insurance company anyway is claiming that cyber attacks like WannaCry are actually acts of war, and for that reason they're not covered by insurance. So if you're talking to the board about transferring risk, this is certainly something to consider. And I'm not sure, Elon, I don't know if we covered in our prep, is insurance part of the cybersecurity plan in your experience with past companies, or has it been part of the plan in past companies?
Absolutely, Dan. I can tell you, and this is something that you are dealing with the board also. This is one of the things that you're showing to the board, that you have a transfer risk. It's like a compensation control in our words, but it's a transfer risk. For that, and the cyber insurance, you need to write the policy, to read down the policy very, very carefully, as you said about act of war and things like that. And you need to see, and by the way, it's not by the CISO done, it's by the risk office. They need to get the right policy for the company. And this is definitely things that the board is interested in, to understand what is the coverage, and guess what, if it's including third-party vendors, if it's including like a wave, like a storm that happening like WannaCry, if it's a dedicated like APT, advanced persist threat, everything is the policy inside. And of course, you need to show to the companies due diligence, due care, and your and what is your mechanism of cybersecurity in the company. I can say that in the last 2 years, I'm visiting once in a year in Lloyd's in London, when we have the policy, and we have like a roadshow with all the companies that making that policy and and they absolutely become very high-level professional, and they're asking you a very accurate and sophisticated questions. So I can summarize that the insurance is something major in your plan. We cannot say that we have a bulletproof, and this is not if we're going to get hurt, it's when we're going to hurt. So this is definitely a major actor in a cyber plan.
Thanks for that. Yeah. So right. So it's not an if, but a when. And if you're thinking about things that way, then insurance is absolutely a part of the plan, from what I'm hearing you say. And yeah, thank you for pointing out it's not necessarily, or probably not usually, the CISO who's taking care of this detail. It's the risk officer in a larger corporation. So thanks for that clarification. So another point that we've heard from other customers that's important to cover is establishing the board's appetite for risk. And this is another framework actually that, and also from Gartner, that maps out the business impact on the vertical axis versus the likelihood of the scenario taking place on the horizontal axis. So if you combine those two, you can get to risks rated from 1 to 3, 1 being loss of product and manufacturing secrets, or 2 being loss of consumer confidence, and then 3 being actual degradation of production volume, which certainly is the likelihood in the case of OT risk. So if you can establish with the board what is their appetite, then you'll probably have a better chance of explaining where the improvements can come with the board's commitment and resources, whether that be budget or establishment of metrics that help track people's time. So it's just one example of a way in which you can sort of gauge the board's appetite for risk. And once you've done that, you can maybe more easily bring up the costs or the budgets that you're asking for. So this is one example. There are obviously the budgets are as varied as the companies that are asking for them. But you might say, well, we in order to establish our current level of OT risk, we need a third party to come in, possibly to do a vulnerability assessment or asset inventory. We might need to hire someone to do incident response or have them on call. We might need to segment networks. I mean, these are all examples that the CISOs on the call are probably familiar with. You might want to set aside time and money to upgrade legacy equipment, and then of course budget to monitor networks over time. Ilan, is cost typically a sticking point with the board when you go to the board, or what's the primary method that you use to ask for a budget that you need?
So most of the time we are not speaking about budget. I mean very specific budget. We're talking about overall budget, how much we spend this year, how much we're going to spend in our yearly plan. For that, they're asking, of course, if it's enough money, and this is very tricky question because sometimes in the board you have also the CEO and the CFO of the company, and you need to be very gentle with your answers. That you cannot cry and say that I don't have enough budget, I don't have resources, because probably the next thing that you to do after you've been in the board is to go to the unemployment agency. So. So what I'm saying is it's not just about the numbers, it's about the action for that. And if you harness the board to your plan, and of course you're doing that with the risk office. One of the things that I wanted to mention for those last slides that show about the risk, that you need to be part of the alliance. Yes, thank you, Dan. You need to be part of the line with the risk office, because the risk is represented by the risk office. Of course, you're helping them to do the map and everything. And then you come together with the risk office, the risk officer, and the chief risk officer, and then you present that to the board, how much money you spent on that. And there is a lot of questions about money, but not in details, like do you have enough money to go to the OT environment, and what is the pace that you are doing the segmentation or other things for that. If you need to accelerate that, do you need more money for that? And I said you need to be very gentle with your and sensitive with your questions about that. But we're talking about the budget. We're talking about if there is enough or not enough. And as I said, this is very good tip to be gentle with and to understand what you're answering for that. And and that's all. That's all from perspective of budget. There is not sometimes they are focused in one area about the budget, but most of the time this is not about just the budget and how much you spent on that.
Great. That's a really important point, and I remember, just for the listeners, some of the stuff that we're talking about now is fresh. I haven't spoken to Ilan before, so this is very much a live interview. Others I've heard about already, and so that actually leads into the point that one of my favorite points from our previous discussions, which is about helping the board understand that OT security does not equal IT security, and then how that ties into the ask for the board. So starting out from just the differences between IT and OT security that are important to explain, because to the extent that the board already understands security, they probably understand it in an IT context. And so that means that they're used to thinking about, if not, the actual protocols, the idea that, communication is standardized over the internet or over, an intranet. And of course, they're familiar with the fact that the PCs that are being used, use a standard operating system. They're familiar with Windows and, have heard of Linux. They're probably, they may not know the terms active vulnerability scans versus passive, but they know that, in the past, companies they've been associated with have had regular patching and OS upgrades. All that, is thrown out the window when it comes to OT. So we're talking about non-proprietary protocols. So in other words, if the communication standards if the communication protocols are not standard, that means that the monitoring methods won't be standard and will require specialization. They may need to be reminded or educated regarding the fact that the devices controlling physical processes don't use things like Windows and Linux, and they use non-standard, embedded platforms, which again means that they require non-standard security tools to monitor or to assess vulnerabilities. And then they may not be aware that, just because you have an older Windows system, it doesn't necessarily mean you can, simply patch it, because, patching, well, especially in pharmaceuticals, patching might lead to, having to retest drugs, which can be enormously expensive and time consuming. So really everything in OT gets flipped upside down, which leads me to this conclusion that it's probably important to tell the board that OT is from Mars and IT is from Venus. And as Vom Voster said from Gartner, enterprises with both IT and OT, they struggle with the coexistence of two separate security and risk management functions. And this leads to a dispersed view of the overall operational risk the enterprise is facing. So having said all that, I want to hand back to Ilan and talk about, how do you harness the board to help you overcome these challenges in getting IT and OT to work together?
So I think this is a major point. I think this is one of the major points who is dealing with industry and with the OT, with SCADA and things like that. The board member most of the time not understanding what is the difference, and the CISO duty is to explain them in non-technical language. And you definitely cannot put on the slides protocols and name of protocols and things like that. You need just to make it more simple, that they are protected, they are not protected, they are not protected because that and that and that. And this is make the exposed much more bigger to the risk. And the probability, of course, is much more higher according to that. So this is a journey. This is a journey that you need to do with the board and let them understand that in their language for that. And you can ask for them, and then you can harness the board. You say, because most of the OT sometimes, or not sometimes, I think usually is not part of the IT, is by the engineering side or other operational group of the company, and it's a little bit more, let's say, much more challenge to get inside there and to do some cyber activities inside the plants, manufacturing. For that. So you can harness the board to that, to say that the challenges with that is to work with the engineering together, and there is a lot of boards that they are an active board, when they hear something like that, they said, okay, the next time that you come to this committee, we want to see also the engineering side, what they're doing in cybersecurity and how they working with you. And you just accept that with both hands and saying, thank you, God, we done it. Because when the board is asking to you, as I said in the beginning, this is an offer that you cannot refuse. And you must be participate in the cyber game and to be part and actor with that. So in the beginning, so the first stage is to let the board understand that the OT environment it's much more exposed, and the challenge about that is to harness the manufacturing, the engineering side to your side, and then both of them, both you and the engineering, coming to the board together, and this is make a huge difference how the company is. I mean, the other side, the engineering side, how they're considering cyber and how much they're willing to help you through their scheduling busy times to help you for that. Dan.
Great. Yeah. So, okay. So 2 points there. One is probably a point taken that this slide should probably never be shown to the board because it does include, as you mentioned, names of protocols, et cetera. And I think you make a good point that, your presentation needs to be simple and it needs to explain in their language, what are the differences between OT and IT. And then I think to highlight that second point you made, and maybe we can dig on that a little bit further, you're saying, if I understand you correctly, you're saying when you speak to the board about the difference between IT and OT, their reaction might be, I see, like, who can we talk to on the OT side or in the engineering side to ensure that communication is taking place and that cooperation is happening? And is it the case that I mean, I think you said literally that, or I'm not sure if you meant literally that, someone responsible for plant management or engineering and OT would come to the board the next time with you? Or is it that you would have metrics that measure their participation and then report that back to the board?
So, as I said, when you're dealing with the board, you need to be very gentle and very sensitive what you're saying about that, what you're showing to them for that. So what you're doing, you're doing kind of a plan. How do you think we can approach the OT environment for that with the really key measures, how we can measure the progress for that? But you also notice, as I said before in my previous answers, that you need to harness the engineering for that. And you can suggest very slightly that the next time the engineering will show with you on the show, on the presentation, and they will be, and you and the engineering together will give the data to the board. In that way, you harness the board to helping you to go through the OT.
Great, I love it. So, I mean, maybe to summarize again, it's the idea that you're sort of helping the board come to the realization that the CISO needs OT's help, and then establishing metrics that track OT progress along these, some security measure, and then establishing with the board that you're going to report back on that. And then once you've done that, when you go to OT and ask for, their time in what's undoubtedly an incredibly busy schedule and with many other pressures, they're more likely to give you time because they know that what they do will be reported back to the board.
Yeah, absolutely. Just let me insert in. And also they need, and if you are doing a really success about transferring the idea and transferring of the risk, they will need to be showing with you, to be presented with you on the next time when you are on the board about the progress. So you harness them, they must be participate physically with you in the board.
I love it. Yeah. Okay. So if they have to go to the prints, then they will surely make sure that they are prepared.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. So jumping on, so once you've established what the costs are, whether it's money or budget or whether it's time from engineering, it's important to outline that there are benefits associated with the cost outlays. Just point out that here's what the future state will bring us. Whether it's avoiding revenue loss, so due to production downtime, the ability to target costs more accurately, which is always of value to a CFO. And then, if we improve IT and OT communication, it means that the IT resources in which we've already invested, meaning, the SIM, the UTM, everything that's in your security operations center can be used to secure OT assets efficiently. assuming that you're buying a tool that can in fact integrate with those tools, and of course, one would hope that you are. And then the other benefit is that if there is an attack or an outage, reaction times will be faster because communication between the two, the IT and the OT camp, will have been facilitated. So moving on, I want maybe coming back to a previous example of just talking about the board versus the audit committee. We've seen a trend in the last 8 years since the economic downturn that towards assigning specific resources to manage risk. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Ilan, the risk officer as opposed to the CISO looking at insurance. And so there are many committees of the board, and they'll directly manage compliance, finance, and investment. In some cases, specifically cyber. In other cases, maybe as in the case of some of the companies that you've worked for, Ilan, an audit committee will manage cyber. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that point. I don't know if there's necessarily another question here for you, Ilan, but sort of the idea that maybe a CISO needs to be flexible and be able to present not only to the board but also to whichever committee is reporting back to the board on cyber.
Yes, and also there is some. May I come in, Dan? It's okay.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah,
sure. Yeah. So, yeah, and I can tell you that from my experience, that sometimes the board asking you to go to some other committees or other groups like executive management, and to show them and to do to them some a presentation about some subject that they will need to be aware for that. So you get an assignment from the board also, and to do those kind of things. And I can tell you that I think I told that in the beginning, and today the board is kind on an anxiety. They have a direct responsibility for cyber effects for that. So I think it is something you need to guide them how to go through to that. Yes, that.
Good. Okay, so a couple of other points before we think about metrics, and one is just sort of who else is informing the board. So I wanted to give a couple of examples of audit oversight directives, and these are largely compiled by Gartner again. So one is that the boards are being told that they need to understand cybersecurity as an enterprise-wide risk and not just an IT issue. As we discussed, they're being told to understand the legal implications of risk. They're being told that they should have adequate access to cybersecurity expertise, which I think, in some cases leads back to this question of whether or not there's a specific committee assigned to oversee security. They're being asked to have an enterprise-wide cyber risk management framework. So if you're wondering, whether or not the NIST framework or whether or not, the NIST regulation or, like the Gartner framework would be useful, it's likely that it would be, as Ilan said, and as Gartner is pointing out here, some sort of framework is typically helpful in understanding something that's large and as complex as cyber risk. And then finally, there's a discussion of cyber risks that should include which risks to avoid and which risks to transfer through insurance. Again, as we mentioned earlier. The other thing I wanted to somewhat briefly cover is, what types of questions should one be prepared to answer? What are the questions or maybe the curveballs, as we say in the U.S. parlance, that the board might ask? So, I guess maybe most obviously, have we been hacked or breached? And how do you know whether or not you've been hacked or breached? What are typically the best practices for cybersecurity? What's our biggest weakness? I remember this one from previous companies where I worked, where a CISO who was honest about the greatest weaknesses in internal meetings was afforded a great deal of respect. And you in order to build a plan, you have to start from present state, and if there's a weakness, obviously you need to be upfront about what that weakness is. Is there an external auditor or a third party that can give us a vulnerability assessment, for example? Are there disagreements between the IT team and the board, or the OT team and the board, or IT and OT? Expose those, bring those to light, and again, as Ilan mentioned, harness the board to help smooth over those differences or fix those differences. You know,
Dan, may I
yes,
come in?
go ahead, please. Yeah, please, Ilan.
So from my experience, I can share also the other few things that the board is doing except what we have in your slide here. So one of the things sometimes they're calling for experts from other companies like EY, Deloitte, something like that, and they asking you to come, and they have like kind of a presentation also, and then they ask you correlated about what this person is doing and thing like that. So you need also to face other experts that they bringing in inside and the discussion of you. It's make you a little bit nervous because sometimes the idea is not the same and you have a kind of a conflict with these things. Also, they can ask you about to do a special committee for cybersecurity in some area for that. It's up, and also what they can do also and asking you regularly about BCP. I can hear a lot about that. Do you have a clear BCP DRP plan for that? And this is a lot of questions running about that. Do you doing a dry drill about that? So this is also kind of questions that coming in when you are dealing with the board.
Very good. Thank you for that. Yeah. So a couple of other, thank you for adding those. And I think there's a couple of other examples here. I really like the example you give of, bringing in an expert from a major consultancy, for example, to speak about risk. The last couple of slides, actually the last slide in terms of what to present is just, to establish metrics. And I have, the metrics themselves should be simple. This slide is also quite simple. The metrics need to be owned, I guess somewhat obviously, and of course they need to be actionable. I'm very curious to hear, Ilan, what are the types of metrics that you've established at the companies you've worked at, and maybe some tips on how to actually show those in slides. I know, we talked previously, you couldn't actually show the slides that you show for obvious, confidentiality reasons, but if you can sort of walk through what's the correct level of detail, how do you speak the board's language when you're talking about metrics, et cetera?
So I can tell you that the metrics should be, as I said, not a very specific and not a lot of details about that. This is something that you can measure. For example, you can show a matrix, how many events, cyber events you had in your company, and how many ransomware were inside. What was the impact of that by numbers, or and by mostly about more by numbers. How much phishing attempts and how much will succeed and how much not will succeed. Something that they can be familiar, and you can give him the quantity, not just about the quality. So you can give him the quantity, how much your organization is dealing with cyber risk and cyber events inside. Along with that, you can go for the, and this was about the quantity. And for the quality, you can give one example, a clear example of event, or how sophisticated it was and how you deal with this sophisticated one. So you can bring in for the metrics about numbers, about things that are happening inside your network, and then you can do a focus, a drill down for one event or maybe two events that show the sophistication of the event and how your team, your SIMSOC, your everything will stop this event and how we deal with that event. And there's a lot of questions about that done sometimes. And this is very good slides and metrics that you can do. Make it simple as you wrote. Give him numbers, give him kind of a time chart, how much it was in, for example, each month. If we see any kind of a raise of the risk, increasing of the risk, and then what you're doing that and what you're doing if you get kind of an impact to the business. So what is the mitigation activity you're doing about that? As I said, it's very important to say that there is no bulletproof and things happen, but we are control them. Dan.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you for making that last point, especially. I don't know that we've stressed this at all yet, but to ensure that the board understands that there's no such thing as 100% secure and nothing is bulletproof, I think is an important point that we previously neglected to mention. The other quick takeaways I took there was that you're saying you can and should be quantitative. You can measure things like number of events, instances of ransomware found. And maybe the thing that really stuck out for me was, something as mundane, if I may, as phishing attacks, but still as important as phishing attacks, because, it seems like every time we hear about a new attack, the likely start of that attack vector is some sort of phishing attempt. And it's, humans are, in many cases, the weakest link. And that's not to say that humans are dumb. It's to say that, effort must be made to educate the people in your company and to guard against phishing attacks. So what better way to do that than to report up to the board? Here's how many attempts we had, and here's how many people clicked through. And then the other takeaway I had was to report this stuff over time, right? I mean, monthly, January, March, February, whatever. Here's how many we saw, events, phishing attacks, et cetera, and show either progress or devolution. And then the last takeaway I think that you made there is to not just focus on quantitative, but also focus on qualitative. You can deep dive into a particular incident and talk about how your team responded. And at that point, if I understood you correctly, especially be prepared for questions from the board about, what did or didn't happen. So thanks for all those points. I think the metrics are a very important part of the presentation to the board. Now, having said all that, let's take a step back and talk about, we talked about the why you would present and then what to present. Well, just a couple quick points on how, and maybe the most important point that you discussed with me previously was the importance of just knowing your board. Who's on the board, what are their individual backgrounds, what's the role they serve on the board of directors, and then what are their biases, right? Everybody has them, and it's important to know what they are. I think one of the things that you said earlier that impressed me was, or made an impression rather on me, was that some people on the board, or I think the word you used was excitable, or maybe better, or another word would be just more interested in cyber, and they're going to proactively reach out with questions about things that are being reported in the media, and so maybe you can point to a couple points on how to. Once you've established who is on the board and who is more interested and less interested, how does that affect your presentation style? Like, how do you approach someone who's more interested, and how does that differ from how you approach someone who's less interested in the issues that you're bringing to the fore?
Hi. So I'm seeing that we're running out of time, so I'm trying to do that shortly because I have a lot of things to talk about that. So this is kind of a process because everybody knows that you have to send the presentation a few weeks or before the board meeting, and they have to read that and then making questions. So when you come to the presentation, they supposed to already read that and to have their questions on a paper for that. So so you will understand, I mean, almost not immediately, but during the presentation, you will understand who is the really person that really know technology and who is on anxiety and who is bringing more knowledge for that, who is maybe a little bit agnostic for that and looks like worried for that. And there is always will be kind of those characters for that. From my experience today, and I see that in the last 10 years with the board, working with the board, like almost 11 years I'm working with boards, that today everyone is almost participating in the discussion. Some of them more, some of them less, but they're definitely, and I can tell you that it's even go after the meeting, you get an email by the board or by the secretary of the board. A lot of time after my meeting with the board, that sometimes I have only 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then it take more than 1 hour, and then they have to stop because they have a very tight scheduling. I get questions by emails, and I have to answer them to the secretary of the board for that. So this is a process how you know your board, who is the more technology guy, who is coming from other industry and try to bring in some knowledge for that, and what the skills of them. So as I said, this is a process, and today most of them really getting into the cyber affairs.
Thank you, Ilan. Yeah, so all good points. And so what you mentioned, we're running a little bit short on time. Lots of good content here to get through. So, briefly in summary, what to present. You want to establish the scope of the risk without getting into FUD, tie risk to business value, introduce some sort of framework, establish metrics, and don't forget to outline the benefits that your desired actions will bring. Here's if I have the board's cooperation, budget, time, et cetera, here's how things will be better in the future. and then of course make the ask for budget, time, cooperation, and then sweat the details. Know the board itself and anticipate questions. I wanted to very briefly cover, when one is looking for an OT cybersecurity solution. Sort of the 5 challenges to address are, knowing what you have in your network, or doing the appropriate asset inventory, having some sort of vulnerability assessment, doing continuous OT threat monitoring, making sure, as we mentioned previously, that whatever you're using can be tied into your existing tools in the previously IT Security Operations Center, and then have some sort of, or have threat intelligence that can tell you about the vulnerabilities in the PLCs that you're using, or what the latest attack vectors are, who is targeting the company itself, and how. And then finally, as we have, I'm going to leave a couple minutes for questions here. I'll leave this slide up so that people know about resources. On the cyberx.io website, you can get a white paper that covers much of, but not nearly as much as we covered today with Ilan. So that's called Presenting OT Risk to the Board. There's also an ICS and IIoT risk report that's based on the over 1,300 networks that we've monitored since our founding. And then there's a video interview with Ilan Abadi. So if you want to put a face with the name, you can watch that. And then we have events coming up, 2 in the US, 1 in Canada, 1 in Switzerland, and 1 in Amsterdam. So if you're in any of those areas, we very much would like to see you, and please stop by and let's make a connection. Okay, so with that, I want to thank Ilan again for his time, and of course I'm not saying goodbye yet, but maybe pass back to Carol to see if there are any questions that Ilan or myself can answer.
All right, thanks, Dan. Yes, we do have quite a few questions that have come in, so I'll jump in and get started. The first one says, traditionally, OT does not report to the CISO, but instead up through operations. How are you addressing the issue that the asset owner and their supply chain, OEM, system integrators, suppliers, are the ones who ultimately decide what happens with the assets and if they put security on the assets or not?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So go ahead, Ilan.
Okay, I will take that call. So as I said, I just mentioned a few methods, or let's say tactics, how you're dealing with that, because they are not part of the IT and they are not part of the CISO organization. You harness them through the board. You said those domains are not in my responsibility, but they are exposed to the risk and they need to be managed. So, and you mentioned that you will be more than happy to share your knowledge and to help them to make cybersecurity. So I think that the next thing that happened in the board almost immediately, they must come in, and they coming in. That's all. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Ilan. Go ahead, Carol.
Under what conditions could the insurance companies claim act of war when they refuse to pay? If the attack merely originated overseas, or demonstrably or likely attributed to a state-sponsored attacker?
So this is an answer that I don't have the, let's say, the expertise to answer that, but it's very tricky answers, and it's good, smart questions. The answer is because most of the attack today, they're coming overseas. They're not coming from your region, not from your place, your country, or something like that. They come all over the world by robots or by proxies that people doing hopes and things like that. So there is no evidence for a clear act of war for that. And this is about lawyers, how they're dealing with the policy, what is written down, and how they can do that. So I don't have a straight questions for that. This is not my expertise, but it's definitely complicated. Thank you.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Any questions not answered during this webcast can be sent to q@sans.org. And Dan and Ilan, I will be sure to forward you the questions that are already in the queue.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Sure. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ilan and Dan, for your great presentation, and to CyberX for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.